The invitation arrived on a Thursday, slipped under my apartment door like it wasn't about to change everything. I almost stepped on it. I'd gotten home late, another 12-hour shift at the clinic, the kind where you stop feeling your feet around hour 9, and I was focused entirely on getting my shoes off before I hit the couch. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind of paper that costs more per sheet than I made in an hour. My name was written on the front in blue-black ink, not printed, handwritten, with the kind of deliberate penmanship nobody learns anymore. I should have thrown it away. My name is Josephine Mercer. Most people call me Jo. I'm a physician assistant at a family health clinic in South Philadelphia. I drive a 10-year-old Civic with a crack in the passenger side mirror, and until that Thursday evening, the most complicated thing in my life was figuring out how to pay down my student loans while also having enough left over for groceries that weren't from the sale rack. Then came the envelope. Inside was a single card, ivory, embossed with a small crest I didn't recognize, and a handwritten note that said, "Your father's outstanding debt has been purchased by Blackwood Capital Holdings. We would like to discuss the terms of resolution. Your presence is requested Saturday 11 a.m. 42 Pemberton Square, Suite 900. No signature, just a name typed at the bottom, H. Blackwood." I sat on my couch for a long time after reading it. I didn't call my father that night. I already knew what he'd done. I'd known, in the vague, nauseating way, you know a thing you've been refusing to look at directly, for almost a year. The missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The way he'd gotten cagey every time I asked about the bar he'd bought into with his retirement savings. The time he'd borrowed $300 from me for a short-term thing, and never brought it up again. My father was a good man who made bad decisions in the company of worse men. He always had been. It had cost him his marriage. My mother left when I was 12, and apparently it had cost him something far larger now. I went to Pemberton Square on Saturday. The building was glass and steel, and the kind of quiet that only money can buy. The receptionist on the 9th floor didn't smile when she checked my name off the list. She just said, "Mr. Blackwood will be right with you," and gestured to a row of chairs that probably cost more than my couch, my coffee table, and my entire bookshelf combined. He kept me waiting 11 minutes, I counted. When the door to the inner office opened, I had already decided I wasn't going to be intimidated. I'd rehearsed the whole drive over. I was going to be calm, professional, and clear. I was going to explain that I had no legal obligation to my father's debts, that I had documentation proving my own finances were entirely separate, and that whatever leverage this firm thought it had over me was. Then Harrison Blackwood walked into the room, and for one completely embarrassing second, every word I'd prepared evaporated. He was tall, that was the first thing, then, composed in a way that felt almost deliberate, like stillness was something he'd practiced until it became a weapon. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open in a way that somehow looked like a decision rather than an oversight. He was older than me, I guessed mid-40s, with gray threading his dark hair at the temples and eyes that were a very specific shade of pale gray that I would later waste more time than I'd like to admit thinking about. He looked at me the way people look at something they've been expecting. Not surprised. Evaluating. "Mrs. Mercer," he gestured to the chair across the desk. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I had a choice," I said. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "You always have a choice. I just wanted to make sure you had the information to make one." He sat. So did I. And then he laid it out, cleanly, without drama, the way you'd explain a spreadsheet. My father owed $340,000. It had started as a private loan from a man named Carver, escalated through interest and collateral promises my father had no ability to keep, and had been purchased by Blackwood Capital 3 months ago when Carver's holding company dissolved. "Your father is 63 years old," Harrison said. "He has no significant assets, a closed business, and a health condition that limits his earning potential." "I know," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of that. Carver's people were not patient creditors. He paused. "I am not Carver." I looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not interested in destroying a 63-year-old man over decisions he made when he was desperate and not thinking clearly." He set a folder on the desk between us and opened it. "It means there's a proposal here that benefits both parties." I looked down at the folder. I looked back up at him. "I'm a physician assistant," I said. I make $78,000 a year. I cannot pay $340,000. I'm not asking you to pay it. The room felt very quiet. What I'm offering, he said, is a contractual arrangement, a structured settlement, executed as a private agreement between you and Blackwood Capital, over a period of 2 years. He turned one of the pages toward me. During that period, you would serve as a medical liaison for a set of private healthcare facilities in which my company holds a stake. You have relevant credentials. The facilities need oversight. The work is real and it would be compensated separately, at a rate significantly above your current salary. I stared at him. That's not a settlement. That's a job offer. It's both. He met my eyes steadily. Your father's debt would be forgiven upon fulfillment of the contract. I sat back. My brain was doing the thing it does under pressure, running calculations I didn't ask it to run, checking the exits, looking for the trap. Why? I asked. Why structure it this way? You have the debt. You could collect it through normal legal channels. I could, he agreed. That would take years, yield a fraction of the principal, and result in your father losing the only property left in his name. The house he's lived in for 30 years. He said it without inflection. Just facts. I don't find that outcome useful. What outcome do you find useful? He looked at me for a long moment. The gray eyes were very still. An efficient resolution. I picked up the folder. I read all 17 pages, right there in that chair, while Harrison Blackwood sat across from me and didn't rush me. He answered 2 questions. He didn't try to fill the silence. When I finished, I set it down. I want my own attorney to review this, I said. Of course, he said. I'll have a copy sent to whoever you designate today. I took the copy. I stood up. He stood up. He had that old-fashioned quality, rising when someone else did, the kind of manners that feel almost jarring in a certain type of powerful man because you stop expecting it. He walked me to the door of the suite himself, and as I passed him he said, quietly, "Your father is lucky. He doesn't know how lucky." I didn't answer, but in the elevator going down, alone, I pressed my back against the wall and let out a breath I'd been holding for the entire meeting. I signed the contract 22 days later. My attorney, my friend Barb, actually, who'd gone to law school while I went to medical school and who charged me her friend rate, which was still more than I could comfortably afford, went through it line by line and found nothing predatory. The compensation was real. The facilities were real. The oversight role was legitimate and fell squarely within my scope of practice. The forgiveness clause was ironclad. "It's a good deal, Joe," Barb said, and she looked puzzled when she said it, like she couldn't quite figure out what she was missing. Like, suspiciously good. "I know," I said. "Just be careful," she said. "Men like this don't do things out of the goodness of their heart." "I know that too," my father cried when I told him. Big, ugly, heaving sobs that I had not seen from him since the night my mother left. He kept saying, I'm sorry, I didn't think it would go this far." I held his hand and I said it was okay, which wasn't entirely true, but some lies are just love wearing a practical disguise. "I'll pay you back," he said. "Dad," I squeezed his hand, "don't." The first 3 months I barely saw Harrison Blackwood at all. There were 4 facilities in the portfolio, 2 outpatient clinics in New Jersey, a rehabilitation center in Delaware, and a small surgical center outside Baltimore. I rotated between them on a schedule built around my existing clinic hours. It was a lot of driving. It was a lot of clipboards and staffing assessments and compliance reviews that made my eyes cross by 9 p.m. But the work itself was good, and the pay landed in my account every 2 weeks with the reliability of something mechanical, something that didn't require trust. I would receive emails from a man named Douglas, who was Harrison's chief of operations, when something needed coordinating. Occasionally a note would arrive, actual paper, actual handwriting, that same blue-black ink, when a report I'd submitted was particularly useful. Brief, professional. "Thank you for catching the supply chain issue at the Delaware site. That saved us considerable time." Things like that. I told myself I was not looking for them. The notes. I was not keeping track. I met him in person for the second time, at a quarterly review meeting in October, in a conference room that smelled like expensive coffee and dry erase markers. There were 8 other people in the room. He acknowledged me the same way he acknowledged everyone else, by name, with specific reference to something they'd contributed. But when his eyes reached me, they stayed a beat longer than the others. "The Baltimore numbers are notably better," he said. That's almost entirely your work. The staffing structure was inefficient, I said. It wasn't complicated to fix once you could see the whole picture. Most people can't see the whole picture, he said. Then he moved on, just like that. Afterward, in the hallway, Douglas materialized at my elbow. He was a small, neat man in his 50s with a tidy gray beard and the expression of someone who had seen everything and found most of it only mildly interesting. He doesn't give compliments like that, Douglas told me, in a voice like he was sharing a piece of filing cabinet trivia. In case you were wondering, I wasn't, I said. Douglas smiled like he knew something I didn't. It was November when things started to shift. There was an outbreak of a GI illness at the New Jersey clinic, a bad one, fast-moving, affecting staff and patients both before anyone caught it. I was on site at 6 a.m. when they called me, and I didn't leave until past midnight. We identified the source by early afternoon, a contaminated water filtration unit in the staff break room. But the protocol work took hours. Notifications, isolations, testing schedules, reporting requirements to the state health department. Harrison arrived at the clinic at 3 p.m. I didn't expect that. He came with Douglas and 2 lawyers and took a back office, and I assumed he was handling the liability side of things, which was logical. That wasn't what he did. What he did was show up in the doorway of the room where I was working and ask, "What do you need?" I looked at him over a pile of case tracking sheets. My hair was falling out of its bun. I had hand sanitizer dried on my forearms and I'd missed lunch. "I need 6 more hours and a functioning fax machine," I said. He walked out. 20 minutes later, a working fax machine appeared, literally wheeled in from somewhere by a building facilities person, and a brown paper bag appeared beside it, containing a sandwich from the deli down the block, a bag of salt and vinegar chips, and a coffee with, I checked, exactly the right amount of cream. I stared at the bag for a moment. He came back an hour later. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway, with his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking at the boards I'd set up to track the case progression. "Walk me through it," he said. "You don't need, I want to understand it." He said it simply, like that was sufficient reason, which, somehow, it was. So I walked him through it. And he listened, actually listened, the way most people in conference rooms never do. And he asked 2 questions that were genuinely sharp, and at the end he said, "You're very good at this." I didn't know what to do with that. I looked back at my charts. "It's just pattern recognition. You keep saying things are just something," he said, "like you're apologizing for being capable." I turned to look at him. He was already turning away, moving back toward the door. "Get some rest when this wraps up," he said, without turning back. "That's not a suggestion." I spent a week after that telling myself the coffee bag meant nothing. It was a professional courtesy. The man was efficient. He needed me functional to do my job. End of story. My friend Danya, who had been my roommate in PA school and who had elevated intuition to something close to a superpower, took one look at my face when I told her the story and said, "You like him." "He's my employer," I said. And he's significantly older. Joe." She pointed at me with her chopsticks. "You like him?" I looked down at my takeout container. "He unsettles me," I finally said. "Yes," she said. "That's what liking someone feels like when you've spent the last 4 years only dating people who are safe." I didn't have a response to that. The second time I wore the dress was entirely accidental. There was a charity event in December, a fundraiser for pediatric health services, held at a hotel ballroom downtown, attended by every healthcare-adjacent executive in the Mid-Atlantic region. Harrison's company was a major sponsor. He had mentioned, through Douglas, that my attendance was welcome but not required. I went because the cause was legitimate, and because Barb guilted me into it, and because I'd bought a dress I'd never worn to a wedding that got called off 2 years ago, and it deserved to be taken out at least once before I died. It was dark green, that dress. Long. Nothing particularly dramatic. No beading, no train, just well-cut silk that sat right, which was all I'd ever really wanted out of formal wear. I arrived alone. I was scanning the room for Barb when I heard someone stop moving behind me. That specific silence, the kind that has weight, and I turned. Harrison was standing about 15 feet away. He'd been moving toward the bar and had stopped, completely still. Looking at me. I had never seen him look not composed before. Just for a second that night. Just a brief fracture in that careful stillness. It closed so fast I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking directly at him. He crossed the room. Mercer, he said. He'd taken to calling me that. Just the last name, with a quality that I couldn't ever quite categorize. Not cold. Something else. Mr. Blackwood, I said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. You look... He stopped. Reconsidered. You look well. I looked at him. I knew what he'd stopped himself from saying. I could feel it, the way you can feel a word that's been swallowed. Thank you, I said. We stood there for a second too long. Then Barb materialized at my elbow and started talking loudly about the past hors d'oeuvres, and the moment dissolved. But later, at the table where our group was seated, I caught him looking from across the room twice, 3 times, and both times he didn't look away immediately. He looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to memorize. I drove home that night with my hands tight on the steering wheel, and my heart doing something complicated. I didn't have a name for yet. It was Douglas who told me, in February. We were between site visits, drinking bad coffee in a parking lot in Delaware, because the break room at the rehab center was being repainted, and Douglas said, without preamble, "He bought the debt because of you, you know." I turned to look at him. "Excuse me?" Douglas looked at the middle distance, serene as a man who had already decided to say the thing and just needed to finish saying it. He'd been aware of your work for about a year before the contract. You'd been cited in 2 regional health efficiency reports. He asked about you. A pause. When Carver's portfolio dissolved and your father's debt came up in the acquisition, he structured the arrangement the way he did, because he wanted you to take it. The coffee cup was very warm in my hands. I stared at it. He would never tell you that, Douglas continued. He's aware it complicates things significantly. He has no interest in pressuring you into any dynamic you haven't chosen freely. That's actually why the contract was written the way it was. Clean, professional, above board. Easy to walk away from at the end. I thought about the notes in blue-black ink, the sandwich and the coffee, the fracture in his expression that night at the hotel. How long, I asked. My voice came out quiet. The professional admiration about a year. A pause. The rest? I genuinely couldn't say. Harrison doesn't discuss those things. But I've worked for him for 16 years, and I know what his face looks like when he's trying not to do something. Douglas finished his coffee. He's been trying very hard. I didn't say anything for 3 weeks. I processed. I made my site visits. I submitted my reports. I had 2 completely normal professional interactions with Harrison that I could not for the life of me read, because now I was looking ruins calibration. Then one Tuesday in March, I drove to the Pemberton Square building. I hadn't been back since the first day. The receptionist remembered my name. Harrison's assistant, a young man named George who radiated anxious competence, told me Harrison was on a call and could I wait. I said I could. I sat in the same chairs as the first time. I counted nothing. Harrison came out of the inner office 10 minutes later and stopped when he saw me. He was in his work uniform, dark suit, no tie, collar button open, gray at his temples, those very still, very gray eyes. Mercer. A pause. I don't have anything on the calendar. I know, I said. I didn't make an appointment. I stood. I want to talk to you. Not about the contract. Something moved in his face. He held the door open. I walked through it. The office looked the same as the first time, except now the February light through the windows was March light. Sharper, a little warmer, the particular quality of late winter deciding to relent. I stood in the middle of the room. I didn't sit down. Douglas told me, I said. Harrison went very still. Not his professional stillness. Something different. The kind of stillness that precedes something irreversible. He shouldn't have. He said maybe not. I crossed my arms. Not defensive. Steadying. But I'm glad he did. Because I've been spending 3 months not knowing what I was feeling about you. And it turns out a lot of it was just missing information. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. Here's what I want to know, I said. And I want an honest answer. Not a careful one. Not a strategic one. I met his eyes. If the contract ended tomorrow, if my father's debt was cleared and I walked out of this arrangement and never had another professional obligation to you, would you have said something? Would you have tried? A long silence. The kind that has texture. No, he said. Then, I thought about it. I decided it wasn't fair to you. You didn't ask to be in this situation. You made the best choice available to you under circumstances I engineered, and I was aware of how that looked. I am aware. He paused. I didn't want you to feel like the offer and the interest were the same thing. Were they? I asked. The same thing? He looked at me steadily. No, he said. The offer was because you were the most qualified person I'd encountered to do that work, and I wanted a reason for you to say yes. The interest is, he stopped, started again. The interest is entirely separate and entirely inconvenient, and I've been managing it badly since October. October, the conference room. You keep apologizing for being capable. You bought my father's debt, I said. To get me in a room, I bought your father's debt, he said. To keep Carver's people from destroying his life. The rest was a beat, opportunistic, which I'm not proud of. I looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away, he didn't offer anything else. He just stood there and let me see whatever was on his face, which was more than I'd expected. Harrison, I said. I'd never used his first name before. I watched him register it. I'm not angry. Something crossed his face that I didn't have a word for yet. I'm actually very annoyed, I continued. That you made this whole decision for me. That you decided I couldn't handle knowing. That you were going to just, I gestured, quietly want something and never say it because you decided what was best. That's fair, he said. But, I said, I've also spent the last 4 months in increasingly inconvenient proximity to you, and I think Douglas is right. I think you've been trying very hard not to do something. I took a breath. You can stop trying. He looked at me. The still gray eyes. The very precise pause of a man who was making sure he'd heard correctly. Then he crossed the room. Not fast, deliberately, like every step was chosen. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to look up slightly, and he raised one hand and tucked a strand of hair back from my face. Just that, just a small exact gesture, and he said quietly, "You're certain? I'm a medical professional," I said. "I've reviewed all available information, and I've reached a conclusion." Something broke open in his expression then. Not the careful stillness. Something underneath it, real and unguarded, that I suspected very few people ever got to see. He laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, and then his hand was at my jaw, and he looked at me the way he'd looked at me from across that ballroom, like something he'd been trying to memorize. "Joe," he said, "my name. My actual name, the short one, the one people use when they know you." "Yeah," I said. "My father called in April. He'd heard through some chain of family information that I was seeing someone, and he wanted to know who. I was standing in Harrison's kitchen. A very good kitchen, the kind that actually gets used, which surprised me. And Harrison was making coffee because he had opinions about coffee that I was only beginning to map. "It's no one you know," I told my father. "Is it serious?" I looked across the kitchen at Harrison, who was not looking at me, but who had gone slightly still, the way he did when he was listening carefully while pretending not to. The morning light was coming through the window over the sink and catching the gray at his temples, and I thought, I'm going to spend a very long time learning all the things that are underneath that stillness. I was already looking forward to it. "Yeah, Dad," I said. "It's serious." Harrison turned then and looked at me across the kitchen with his gray eyes and the expression he only had when it was just us. Open, quiet, something I still didn't have a single word for but was no longer in any hurry to name. He set a mug in front of me. Exactly right, the way it always was. Some things you stop needing to explain.